The next definition is door frame, a very generic term, probably countless things to ultimately end up saying, but we'll touch on the topics, the basics of what a door frame is and just the variety of different door frames that come to mind. Let's do that now. Now, one term that I've heard countless times over my career is the term door buck. Door buck. It may not be really obvious what that is, and it's not. At least it certainly wasn't to me for a very long time. But a door frame and a door buck are two different things. Or a window frame. Whether it be a door or a window, we're kind of doing the same stuff. So if you understand how doors work, doors and frames work in residential or commercial construction, you'd be able to wrap your head around windows or aluminum storefront pretty quickly as well, I would think. A door buck is... Old timers would walk in and say, yeah, I got a door buck, or they'd come and say, I need a door buck. And I find that the term was being used, I need a door buck, meaning I need a door frame is what they were saying. But a door buck is really what's between the wall construction and the door frame, or window frame, let's say. And one way to think of it, as I've become aware of, is if you've got a lot of shimming that you need to do, that's a door buck. So if you have a extremely irregular masonry opening, you're probably going to trim that out so that you get true plumb level and square for you to attach your knockdown frame to. If you've got an opening, a masonry opening that's way out of line, and you know what? The client wants a 3070 knockdown. He's going to tap con some wood all the way around the opening to use compression anchors, run the screws through the bottom of the face of the jamb into that wood. That wood that's been tap conned, that's a door buck, is what that is. So it's not a finished member, but it's not the wall either. It's the handshake between the two. So if you hear the term door buck, that's my experience of what that means. Looking at the SDI definition on the page, it says an assembly of members surrounding and supporting a door or doors. So one easy way to also understand door frames is to also not have a preconceived notion about it in terms of door frame and then every part of a part number or just description that you can build after that could look something like single door frame, or or double door frame, or double egress door frame, or something of that nature. And then rather than using a manufacturer's part number and then assuming it's 5 3/4 masonry profile with T anchors, think of it this way. Let's just say single door frame. And then after that you'll give it a size, say 3070, and then you'll give it a jamb depth. So we've gone 30 to 70. In each of those two columns, the size of that door frame can be anything that's permissible for the application. If you needed a 10-foot tall hollow metal door frame, that can be accommodated. If you needed something that was very narrow or very wide, all that can be accommodated. So you've got your width and then your height. It's important to know that in doors, the width is first. In louvers, the width is first. In hinges, the width is the second dimension. And other things as well, like access panels we deal with, or roof hatches we deal with. The hinges are on the second dimension. So if a client says they want a 24 by 36 access panel, the client will always want to test us in terms of what's the width and what's the height. Neither's the width or the height. The hinges are on the second dimension. You can put it in this way, or you can put it in this way. If you want it to open like a hopper window, you can have that. That would be atypical. You just want it to probably be a right hand or a left hand reverse, is what we would say in the door business. So you've got width and then height, and then you've got jamb depth. And that can be as deep of an opening as the application requires. I think the deepest I've done may have been 18 inch or 24 inch, but of course the common is always going to be 5 3/4. very, very typical. And we'll talk about where these jam depths come up or come from. And then we're going to talk about the primary difference between, and we will dovetail into it in a moment, between masonry style and drywall style. So with height jam depth, that frame has a depth indicated. What I like to do is put the throat size after it. I like to have both there. Now that's not normal or typical. If you're saying I need a 5 3/4 masonry frame, masonry versus drywall means that when you call out the depth of the frame, you're meaning the jam depth. The jam depth is the depth of the frame, the overall depth. And going through the anatomy of parts on a frame, we're going to do as well. I want to write that down so I don't forget. We're going to go over the anatomy of it, and then the difference between masonry and drywall. I like to put the throat size as well, if it's not a mullion or something that has a throat, because there's a basic understanding that when you're speaking about masonry frames, we're only talking about the jam depth. Because between jam depth and throat opening, in masonry frames, the jam depth is more important rather than throat opening. You want to know the throat opening, but it's not more important. It's like, what's the most important dimension on a door? Well, there probably isn't a most important dimension on a door, but what's the one you want to know first? Tell me the width first. On a hinge, what's the most important dimension on a hinge? Again, there may not be one, but tell me the height first. I want to know the height first, and that's why that dimension is probably first. So when you're talking about drywall frames, the standard handshake there is that we are talking about a throat opening. The most important thing on a drywall frame is to know first what's the throat opening. So if you order a frame from a manufacturer and you're using their part number for masonry, and then you give them a depth, they're going to assume that's the jam depth in most instances. If you are ordering a door frame from the factory and you're giving them the part number for a drywall frame, and then you give them a dimension, I won't say the word depth, they're going to assume that's the throat size. Because in knockdown drywall frames, what's most important is, what are you fitting the frame over? How thick is all of that? In a masonry frame, it's usually how deep is that frame to make sure that it's not going to be larger than what I'm attaching it to. Or in some cases, it's intentionally larger. I found that over the years, and in our industry, the amount of people that start in the industry is a big number. And then the amount of people that are there after 10 years and 20 years and 30 years and 40 years goes down, meaning the people with more years of experience will understand the basics much better than someone that's new. So I would constantly get a question from the manufacturer, and they'd say, well, is that the jam depth or the throat opening? It's a masonry frame, so it's just the jam depth. And I kept doing that. It's a drywall frame, and I say 4 7/8 on a drywall frame, and I'll get a question, hey, is that the jam depth or the throat opening? And the reason that that's coming to me and to everyone is because the people asking the question genuinely aren't there yet in their career. They don't know the right answer. So I've taken to listing both. 5 3/4 jam depth, 4 7/8 throat opening. And why 4 7/8? We'll go over that in a moment. So width, height, jam depth, throat opening, gauge. What's the gauge of the door frame? Typical is 16 gauge in commercial. You'll see 18 gauge. If you're doing a 40-story condo building and you're building it in 1971, going to be a lot of hollow metal frames on the interior of those condos. 18 gauge is perfect for that. It just really is. 3.5-inch hinge prep, T-strikes, the whole 9 yards. That's all really good. But the standard for commercial is going to be 16 gauge. And in the realm of what you can do, it'll be 18 to 16 to 14. You can do 12. And after you get thicker than 12, it's no longer hollow metal at that point. And then it's the type of steel. You can do cold rolled steel, which is just our typical steel that will have a prime coat on it. Doesn't have to be gray. Pioneer had always used Indian red primer color is what it was. They don't anymore, and they haven't, I don't think, for years. And I've not seen I don't know if it's called Indian red, but I believe it was. I haven't seen a red prime door in a long time. Or you can do galvanized. You can do galvanneal. There's different ways that you get a galvanized product. So you have to specify the gauge, the gauge and the type of the steel. Then after that, what I like to do is I'll indicate whether it's single rabbet or double rabbet. If there's something unusual about it in terms of dimensions, that's where I call it out at that point. In the header of a hardware set, you're going to have a description of the door. It's important to list there, say, the soffit size, so that when soffit applied hardware is in that hardware set. So if I have a coordinator or I have a parallel arm bracket that's going to mount to the soffit, you're going to indicate 2 1/4 soffit dimension. But I wouldn't indicate 2 1/4 soffit dimension when I was ordering a door frame, because there are certain things that you can really take for granted as standard. 2-inch face, 5/8 projection stop, a 1/2-inch return. These are things that you can take for granted. In terms of whether it be equal or unequal rabbet, you're probably going to look at your manufacturer's standard for that and use their part number. But if you're not, and your manufacturer, like Seco, offers both, you'll want to call out if it's equal or unequal rabbet. Is there an argument for one over the other? Unequal rabbet, it was used and is used because if you had an 1 3/8 door, you're not changing your press brake for 1 3/4 or 1 3/8 doors. You have unequal rabbets, 1 15/16 and 1 9/16. Equal rabbet is really nice also because there have been times when a customer's called and said, yeah, I ordered a right hand. Well, yeah, we shipped you a right hand. Yeah, no, you didn't ship me a right hand. The door I need swings out. Okay, well, it's not a right hand then, so you should have said left hand reverse. So what you can do in those instances, because what's occurred, that frame went in 3 months ago. Mason set it, it's been sitting there for 3 months. Now they're there to put the doors on and to find out, yeah, all those frames were set such that they were right hand, because that's how they were ordered. At least in this case, if you were so lucky as to have rim-mounted exit devices, you could use continuous hinges and rim exit devices and hang that door in the opposite rabbet, because it's equal rabbet. That would work out fine. So you've got to decide how much of that you're going to specify. If your factory has both equal and unequal, you'll have to tell them what you want. Then after that, what I like to do is spell out what I'm prepping the door for. Prep for 3 5-inch by 0.190 butts, and then whatever by 4 7/8 strike. And then I tell the factory what I want it reinforced for. Reinforced for parallel arm closer. What else might I want the frame reinforced for in a standard application? Reinforced for surface bolt, because you know that you've got prep for 4 7/8 and deadbolt strike, and then the client's going to put surface bolts on there. So you could tell them to reinforce for a surface bolt as well, in the sense that you'll apply a strike to the soffit of the frame, but that will give them enough steel thickness to drill and tap to, is the point of that. Then I'll give the factory the hand, and I'll give the factory the tag number, and I always put there the degree of opening as well. Left hand by 90 degree, so that it tells the installer, hey, well, that'll be in the door closer line as well, but it'll tell them, hey, you're templating for 90 degree open on this. And that's really typical. Now, I had talked about the difference between masonry and drywall. Let's talk about the difference between those two right now. If you are enjoying this video, please click thumbs up or like, and also please consider subscribing to our channel. Let's move on to the rest of the video. So when it comes to masonry frames, you are very commonly going to butt the frame up to the end of a wall. And let me grab a jam section. And here is a typical masonry profile. This is probably 5 3/4. I don't know who the manufacturer of this is. It doesn't matter. And with a masonry frame, you'll generally take this 5 3/4. We'll talk about the anatomy in a moment, and you'll probably T-anchor that to a wall that's much thicker than 5 3/4. You could have face brick and block, and all of that together is some dimension like 9-inch. And the important part about a masonry frame is how deep is it, because I need to make sure that frame depth is really compatible with the thickness of my wall. What's less important to know is what's the throat opening. And in fact, I would argue that it doesn't even matter what the throat opening is. I suppose you could say that, yeah, you do need to know what this size is. And the reason you may need to know that size, I imagine I've been asked that because, in that scenario, you get face brick and then block. The client wants to know, well, how big is that, so he knows where to position this in the thickness of the wall, I suppose. So it could also be just as convenient to know that the relationship between jam depth and throat opening is throat opening equal jam depth minus 1 inch. Except I had said why 4 7/8. On 4 7/8, on 5 3/4 frames, they will always have a 4 7/8 throat. That's because the return becomes 7/16 from ½ inch. So throat equal jam depth minus 1 inch in all instances except 5 3/4. The reason that that's done is it is more typical to take that type of jam depth frame and fit into it a standard wall type construction. So when we're talking about masonry frames, we're really most concerned with the depth because we want to know how deep the frame is. And depth is a weird word. Depth is just this dimension. Outside here to outside here. That's the depth. I can't make a connection where it comes from, but that's just what it means. Very commonly, you're going to have welded masonry frames that are going in interior partition walls where depth doesn't matter. What matters is the throat. But you're still using a masonry frame. So the 7/16 returns allows you to get to 4 7/8. Well, 4 7/8 is 3 5/8 plus 5/8 and plus 5/8. Now, what does that mean? Well, if you're a 100-year-old carpenter, you would remember when 2x4s were actually 2 inch by 4 inch. Well, called a stud. 2x4 is, just a 2x4 stud. At some point, probably in the 60s, my guess, that went from 2x4 to 1.5 inches by 3.5. 3.5 inches now how big that 2x4 stud is. Well, if you're using metal studs, those are 3 5/8. And if you're using drywall, and it's commercial, you're probably using 5/8 drywall. And a term that people like to throw around is rock. I got 5/8 rock on both sides. So if you hear that, they just mean drywall. 5/8 plus 3 5/8 plus 5/8 equals 4 7/8. That's just what that equals. Now, masonry frames are not ideal in that regard because they have just this return. They don't have a back bend return, which is another return going up this way, which is what drywall frames have, because that makes it easier to slide the rock or the drywall into the throat. Drywall has a paper face on it. Well, when you take a sheet of drywall and try to push it into the frame, you can tear that paper back when you're dragging it against this, not sharp, but this blunt metal end. So drywall frames will have back bend returns. So in those instances where you have welded interior frames, and I'm doing a job right now in Wyoming at a country club, all welded frames, they're masonry, it's all drywall partition. Yeah, that's normal. And the reason that's normal is because you're not going to weld drywall frames, even though you can. But drywall frames aren't built to be welded because they don't have that tab and slot sort of provision where you can assemble the frames together with basically a pliers and a hammer at the top to get the header and the jambs connected to each other before you weld them. So in that instance, knowing the throat is also important. Probably the least important thing to know when it comes to masonry or drywall, jam depth or throat, is knowing what the jam depth is in a drywall application. I don't see a need to really know that. Now, we were talking about what's the most important dimension that there is in order to be the least inelegant when describing what you're working on, giving that dimension first. When it comes to drywall frames, they're still hollow metal frames, they're still 16 gauge, and they're still cold rolled steel, and they're prepped and reinforced for all the same stuff. But those drywall frames, they're inherently meant to go in as a knockdown. They're constructed in such a way that they can be put together in the field without them ever being welded. Whereas masonry frames, you can, but there's no provision to make sure that they stay true, plumb, level, square, and all that stuff. The most important thing on a drywall frame is to know the throat opening, because if someone says masonry frame, they're probably butting the frame to the edge of the wall, even though you can weld them and have partition. When you talk about a drywall frame, you're for sure wrapping the wall. That frame is going to encapsulate the end of the wall, but not in every instance. When I described Buck earlier, I had one customer in Chicago, Stolson Construction, and I think they're still in business, CB from Stolson always wanted, he had saw cut openings in masonry walls. He wanted standard knockdown drywall frames because he was going to build a wood buck and he was going to secure the frame to that. That's just what he wanted. That's how he knew to do it. It always worked for him, and it was the cheapest way, almost the cheapest way to get a frame. Now, why didn't he just take a masonry frame? Well, in a drywall frame, they're meant to go together and stay together as a knockdown because they have a drywall compression anchor and they have a miter and guide system such that when you tighten, and actually what you're doing is loosening the compression anchors at the top of each jam, you're forcing the header and the jams to lock together. So that's what he always wanted, and it always worked for him. Most people would want the frame welded, would want it drilled and dimpled on the jams, and would slide it in, mark their holes, drill for the sleeve anchors, get the frame in, mark the holes, pull it out, drill the holes for the anchors, slide it back in, get it shimmed, true plumb level and square, run those bolts in, backer rod, caulk, and you're done. But again, in drywall applications, most typically, you're wrapping a wall. Think of the restroom that you walk into in your favorite coffee shop. That's always a knockdown 3-piece drywall frame. And when we say 3-piece, there's only 3 pieces to it. You don't have a sill, unless, of course, you do have a sill. That could happen. I've done doors for shipping containers. They're going to use shipping containers, and they want a 4-sided door frame. Okay, no problem. That's no problem at all. Not an issue. But it'll be 3-sided because you have a hinge jam, a strike jam, and a header. But I think I have seen the term 4-sided door frame, and I'm thinking, okay, this is a ship. Someone's going to step over the sill, or it's some unusual application, and they just want a 4-sided welded door frame. When it comes to door frames and 4-sided, you would also think of borrowed lights. Obviously borrowed lights are 4-sided. They can be done knockdown. They can be done welded. They can be done split frame style. And that's another frame type that we'll talk about here as well. So we've talked about putting the structure together of how to detail a typical opening, the importance of each of those pieces that are there, the difference between masonry and drywall, and why jam depth is more important in some instances, and why throat opening is more important in other instances. But we've also talked about how they can be important in the other application. The most important thing is that you start to learn and understand what's the crucial thing with this opening. What does the frame have to contend with? You got a 12-inch thick wall. Does your frame need to be 5 3/4? Maybe. Maybe that's what they want. Maybe it would be better if it was 8 3/4. What does the wall look like? Where's the best place to bolt that to or to T-anchor that to? Is there some sort of wall construction that you'd like to bridge over? Or maybe what you really need is in a 12-inch thick wall, you need a 12 and an 1/8-inch throat size because you want to encapsulate all that wall all the way around. In steel buildings like the one that we're in now, they'll just have corrugated metal on the outside and just C-structure. And that's the door buck. So what you have to do is come in with a frame that will generally work with that to be screwed to that door buck or whatever the case might be. I think what we'll do is let's talk about the different types of frames just loosely, and then we'll look at, well, before we get there, jam depth. Your standard sizes will be 4 3/4, 5 3/4, 6, 7, and 8 3/4. That's in everyone's catalog. Masonry. When it comes to drywall, we're really thinking about the throat opening. So 4 5/8 possibly. 4 7/8 most absolutely. 5 1/4 is not unheard of. 6 1/8 really common. 7 1/4 is not uncommon. 7 1/4 throat. 7 1/4 throat is going to be a 6-inch metal stud with 1 layer of drywall on each side. That's really common. 6 1/8, that's going to be a 3 5/8 metal stud and 4 layers of drywall. 2.5 plus 3 5/8 will get you to 6 1/8. So all of these throat sizes, they mean something. 4 5/8, that's easy. That's going to be 3 5/8 metal stud with 1/2-inch drywall. That's a combination that you'll find, that you'll bump into. So every throat opening is not random. There is a reason for that. There is a wall construction type for that. But you'll also see when you're looking at blueprints, when you're looking at blueprints, you've got these wall sections, and it's just these sizes that aren't typical. So they're all custom made. It turns out that's just how that is. So before we switch to the screen view, we'll go over the anatomy of a jam. And then we'll switch to the screen view and look at the definition, look at a typical price list just to see different stuff. We'll talk about the different door frame types that exist, and that'll be that. Okay, let's talk about the anatomy of a door frame. So we've used some terms already really quickly. Jam depth, it's the dimension from here to here. It's the overall depth of the frame. If you're looking at it in elevation, how deep is it, or how deep is it? Throat opening, the distance between the returns, whether it be a return like this or it be a backbend return. We've also used rabbet. This is an unequal rabbet frame. That's 1 15/16, and that's 1 9/16. That's meant for 1 3/4 thick doors, and that's meant for 1 3/8 doors. We've also said the term soffit. That's this. You can just do your math. Jam depth minus rabbet 1 minus rabbet 2 equals soffit. This is the stop, or the stop face. Everything that I've got underneath the pads of my fingers and thumbs, that's the stop. But the stop is broken into the stop face, or here, and then the soffit. I also use the term face. 2-inch face is standard. That's a return, generally 1/2 inch, but can be 7/16. And if there was a backbend return, it would come straight this way. 5/8 is the standard projection for stops, but sometimes that's different to account for a UL requirement, like on a transom maybe, or a borrowed light, which it becomes 3/4 inch. So let's now switch to the screen view and take a closer look at the supporting information. If you've not hit subscribe yet, we would very much appreciate if you did, and hopefully you're enjoying this video. Now let's get back to it. Here's our definition: door frame, an assembly of members surrounding and supporting a door or doors. Okay, so let's take a dive into a technical manual. I've been using this DCI Hollow Metal on Demand. I don't know anything about their company, but I like their technical manual. They're probably I wouldn't say a small size company, but compared to Seco or Curry's, I would think they'd classify themselves as small. Okay, so I had thought about earlier, we have to go through the different anchors that you'll end up seeing. And it looks like the beginning of the section is about frame, so we'll scroll through here and see. So an A1, their standard strap anchor. This is going to be for some type of stud construction, obviously. Probably wood studs would be my guess, is how that's going to be. Those will be welded in. You'll slide your straps around your stud. You'll screw through the face of those into the stud, and the drywall gets slid over it. Drywall has to penetrate at least 1/2 inch for fire rating. This would be a welded-in steel stud anchor. You'll run tiny mini screws through the back of the metal stud into this flange. Those are always welded in. Many frame anchors must be welded in. Some frame anchors can be welded or shipped loose, and some can only be shipped loose. This is a Z, what I would call a Z anchor. Again, it's a metal stud anchor. Yeah, flush metal stud anchor. Okay, so flush. You'll notice here that this would be for an application where they are going to do all the framing. Probably just slightly larger than the outside dimension of the frame. Same concept, they'll zip through the back of those studs, and then the drywall will penetrate inside of here. So that's flush out here. In a standard metal stud anchor, it's not flush. That stud sits well inside of that throat opening. Okay, that's a floor anchor. Those are welded in. That allows you to take a welded frame or well, whatever, and secure it down to the floor through the back of the frame. That's a T anchor. That can't be welded in unless it's a welded in T anchor. But T anchors like this are always loose, as are the alternate wire anchors. This is sometimes what's called a butterfly anchor, or it's called a existing opening anchor or a multi-purpose anchor, because this can be shipped loose or welded. You can do a punch and dimple with this. You could, it's never used, but you could run a stud through the back of it, I suppose. This is an existing opening, what we would call a pipe anchor. This is generally, it's best to be welded here and here so that when you tighten the bolt, you don't crush the frame in. This is an adjustable base anchor or adjustable floor anchor if you have a floor that's really out of level before, let's say that there's going to be a concrete pour that'll occur or some flooring condition. This is a wood stud anchor. This is generally shipped loose. These would be for wood studs. Jam depths are listed here. This is they're calling it a universal anchor. This is shipped loose. This could be used for wood studs or metal studs or a dimpled situation. All that would work. This is generally what's called a wood stud anchor. That is what this would be. Wood stud anchors are going to have these flanges because you won't run a screw through the thickness of a wood stud into this flange. You'd bend these tabs over, is what you'd end up doing. This is a compression anchor. This gets us squarely into the realm of drywall frames. As you, yeah, I don't see a great picture of it, but this is a screw. And when you turn that counterclockwise, those threads will force that lug out in that direction. There's a stud sitting here. So as you loosen this one, the plate, the lug goes towards the stud. And when you do it on the other side, it forces the jambs. When the lugs go out, the jambs go in, and that compresses the header up here. And they have a header tab on their drywall frames, obviously allowing you to help lock them in. And then, of course, that miter will keep it reasonably square up at the top. Drywall frames always have a dimple in the bottom. That's standard. But you can also see drywall frames with these straps that are here. But at the end of the day, I just don't see these being what you want, because generally in drywall frames, the rock or the drywall is already up as well, so this doesn't work. So you would use this and run a screw through the base of your jamb. This is, I had said about the T-anchor, those are always shipped loose except when they're not. This is a weld-in T-anchor. These are great. I love these. Once upon a time, they were required for 3-hour fire ratings on UL openings. I like them because you can't forget them. If you walk out to the dock and your truck left 45 minutes ago and you see a box there, yep, that's the box of anchors that they forgot for the 20 frames. These you can't forget. That's called a mullion anchor. I think they're using it as what's called a floor anchor here. You know, if you have a side light frame and you've got a sill on the floor, you'd have a floor anchor on the jamb, and then you'd have a mullion anchor under the mullion. I've really never seen floor anchors used that way, but if you had a wide enough side light, I could see how you would want that. They get into borrowed lights because we're doing door frames. Probably not talk as much about borrowed lights. Rough buck. Yeah, we talked about this earlier. This is a great example. So a buck is not the frame and it's not the wall. It's the part that handshakes the two together. So if you're dealing with if you need an application where you want to put bucks onto the wall, you'll have to change your frame construction a little bit. Great example of a single rabbet versus our typical double rabbet. Great example, and actually they're using that as an example in a double egress frame. The jambs of double egress will always look like this. The header of a double egress will generally look like this, except you have to flip this around in your mind's eye when you're looking from the left side versus the right side. You can also do a header like this on double egress, but it's a lot more work because you've got more to fill in on double egress. You've got 2 areas on each end to fill in. I would say it's more work because the setups aren't identical. This you'll have 2 setups that are identical. And double egress is a very common frame type. Complete corner frame. This is showing us what a typical knockdown masonry frame looks like with the tabs and slots that I had mentioned. Then you can get into what do you do when it comes to welding. Face welded, you'll weld the face of that jamb. You can do a full depth weld where you're welding the inside of this. You'll saw cut this material in full depth weld and weld the face. But those tabs and slots are a hallmark of masonry frames. That's what allows you to get them put together before you try to weld them together. Continuously welded is saw cut and then continuously welded, like it's called. You'll fill in weld back here. Whereas in a standard construction, you will have the ability to see some daylight. Not that you'd see daylight, but it's not completely welded back here. In a continuously welded frame, it would sure be argued that that's a stronger unit. But again, that's all saw cut before it's welded together out of stick material. Typical knockdown drywall, as we had talked about earlier, with compression anchors. That's not a really great way to describe a compression anchor because it's so part and parcel of a drywall frame. Pressure anchor, maybe? No. Let's double down on this. I'm just forgetting what the name is called of the anchor type. DKS has, so does Gulfport, but DKS came to mind first. Yeah, okay, let's take a look. And getting into reinforcements here, I think the anchors are, yeah, pre-clam-8. Let's see if I can show you something better about that compression anchor. Yeah, drywall compression anchor, that's interesting. Drywall compression anchor. And I've got a video of the item here that I would be quite sure that I go into depth about it. So pre-clam-8, you can watch a video there of it. What I want to find is just a pressure clamp is what Gulfport calls it. A little bit better. Yeah, so this gray line that you're seeing here is this. This is what's welded to the inside. Here is a jam. This is welded here. That's this gray line here. And you've got the bolt that fits in here. Then what happens is your plate goes in like this. And as you loosen that screw, that plate goes out, hits against your stud, and you do that on both sides, and that's how the compression works. Okay, back to the DCI manual. 4-inch header. That's very typical. Why does a 4-inch header exist? Well, you want to, when you are laying up your mason wants to, when they are laying up a wall, okay? That's a wall. Well, the way that starts out is a block, and 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 a block. Well, they're all supposed to be the same size, obviously, right? Well, you'll get to the header, and you want your block to be in line with the top of the head. So, if you took 86-inch, which is the overall height of a 7.0, and you divide that by 8, you don't get a good number. If you take 88 and you divide that by 8, you get a whole number, 11. A block is going to be 8-inch tall, if I recall correctly. So that's even. They won't have to chop. You'll get a call from a mason, generally in Chicago in the old days, with a very thick attitude and accent, and wondering why they're yelling at you because they're cutting blocks. And you'll tell them, you never told me that you needed 4-inch headers. I don't assume what you're doing. You know I'm a mason. Yeah, well, sure. I do other things as well. The point of the matter is, if you're doing masonry construction and it's block, you better ask if it's a 4-inch header is needed. That'll be in the plans, but a lot of times it's not caught. This is a mullion. This can be done in as hinge mullions, strike mullions, blank, transom bars. This could be as well. Different construction of that, of how those go together. That would obviously be, a mullion welded into a header, probably a side light frame, a T-intersection for whatever it is, a large sill, 4-inch, 8-inch, that's all pretty typical. A 2-inch profile at the floor does not make sense. It'll look unusual. At least a 4-inch sill. You'll stock 4-inch sill section probably. Anchors for transom bars or whatever it is. Showing a transom panel going in. Obviously a welded pocket door frame. There you go. That's another specialty type that you can do in hollow metal as well. That's neat. Reinforcements that will go into a frame. This is obviously for I'm going to go with a top and intermediate pivot. Yep, top intermediate pivots. Hinge preps. Anchor frame prep, most likely. Yeah, anchor hinge prep. Anchor hinges are really neat. If you've never seen them, and if you do school work, you'll bump into them eventually. That's what an anchor hinge looks like. These straps really keep the door proud, exactly where it's supposed to be, proudly standing without sagging is what I'm trying to say. More hinge preps, heavy duty hinge reinforcements, a lot more steel to weld, a thicker gauge most likely. Pocket pivot prep is what that would be. Pocket pivots are these. They're also known as Harmon hinges. Obviously a strike prep, 2 3/4 strike prep probably. Dust boxes, mortar guards, those are very typical and common in masonry frames. You better have them there if you're supplying a frame to a mason. Cover everything that grout could get into and block up. I've had installers call me and blame me for the fact that the mason packed full all their screw holes. And I says, well, how did they do that? Well, actually what's occurred is I've been called and out to a job, and the guy, it was all pure concrete behind here, just packed in hardened mortar, couldn't run his screws through. And I said, well, I'm not the frame supplier. He's like, yeah, I know that, but what do I do? That's where if someone's using a drywall frame or have removed the mortar guards for some reason, or they just weren't shipped to the mortar or dust guards were not on the frame. Conduit, you're going to run a low voltage to, generally low voltage, doesn't have to be low voltage. You'll have a box for that and a conduit raceway for that. filler plates, etc., etc. Preps and jams for silencers. You don't have to specify that. There are times, though, that I do have it in my part number where I don't want it. If I'm doing weather stripping, I'm going to tell the factory no silencer holes. There's no need to have them. I'm going to have soffit-mounted gasketing, and I don't want there to be an interruption. These are what's called terminated or hospital stops, generally on a miter, 45. They can be at 90 degree. They're meant to facilitate the cleaning of the floor and jam area better than a frame that's got rabbits around the bottom of it like this. Inside corners are harder to keep clean than no inside corners. Frame profiles, yeah, this is neat as well. This is interesting. In the 50s and 60s, I know Pioneer had a really well-developed catalog in terms of really fun profiles. F1, standard double rabbet. F2, single rabbet, with backbend returns. A quirky style backbend return. A shadow line is what this might be called. You can create a shadow line with this as well. The purpose of this, I'm not exactly sure of what that would be. Cased opening frames, another specialty type used for double acting doors or just used to terminate a wall. You can have an angled sort of single rabbet. Those are fun. Same on the face as well. You got to be really careful with that because you're reducing the size of your soffit. This is a stop applied to a cased opening frame, double rabbet. Perhaps more of a residential look on a hollow metal frame. And then, of course, in terms of variables, that 2-inch can get down as far as possibly 3/4. Back in the old days, we used to stock 2-inch face, 1 3/4, 1.5 inches, 1.25, and with those, I could pretty much make anything. The F13, that would be a split frame, where you're going to encapsulate a wall that is irregular, and you could run a screw right through this and hold all that together. Pioneer used to have convex faces out here as well, a lot of curved stuff. I don't have an old Pioneer catalog to show you, but nonetheless. Hinge preps, obviously. Dutch door frames. We're talking about frames. Obviously, a Dutch door frame is pretty typical. You'll have a strike prep that's going to be generally lowered, and it certainly is here. You'll have hinges that are meant to have 2 half door leaves. It's not just cut it in half. Those are adjusted for that. The height, what's neat is 10 3/8, 23 7/8, and 19 7/16 will always stay the same between 6/8, 7/0, 8/0, and so on. That's what'll vary. Showing standard locations for this manufacturer's material. That's just what they do. Keeps it easy. These are top to center lines. So 9 5/8 minus 2 1/4 is going to be 7 3/8. So that's a standard Steelcraft or Amweld location. Dutch door locations on a door. Now apparently we're into doors now, honeycomb. Yeah, so we'll hop out of that. And then I guess the last thing that I would show you would be the manufacturer's price list, and we'll just get into that quickly and see if anything. Actually, we'll look at the product catalog first, just an old Seco product catalog, and we'll take a look at some standard frames. Alternate profiles, as we just talked about, alternate backbends. Okay, so SU is a standard Seco masonry frame profile, unequal rabbet. You want equal rabbet? You can have that, no problem at all. I believe that's the SQ is an equal rabbet. You hop down to drywall frames. You got your DU and your DQ. I think the difference between D and B is equal or unequal rabbet. Don't quote me on that. I'd have to study that in the catalog. Made-to-order frames. Yeah, this is a great example of everything has to be tailored when it comes to this material. The only time you'll have a limitation or something you cannot have is when the machinery just can't do it. You're asking for a bend that's too small or in an area that's just simply too tight. This would be a integrated weather strip frame that will take a Q-Lon type material that's got a kerf in it. It's not a kerf, it's just the way that they bent that frame. Possibly roll formed, but I'm not really sure. Thermal brake frames, there is literally no steel touching the exterior or interior of a frame. Pre-finishing is very much available. I believe it would have a very high minimum quantity requirement, hundreds probably. Performance data, yeah, showing how they test the material. windstorm products, and now we're back indoors. Okay, that will conclude our discussion of door frame. Door inset, that's the next thing to talk about. That's really important. Let's go on to door inset next. Thank you for watching, and if you've enjoyed this video, please click thumbs up. Please subscribe and maybe even send the video to someone that you know. Thank you.